Step away from the counter, ma'am, or I'll have security escort you out right now. The words didn't echo. They cut, sharp and public, slicing through the polished silence of the downtown Manhattan branch like a blade drawn too fast. Every head turned. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Even the quiet hum of counting machines seemed to hesitate. Naomi Carter didn't move. She stood there in a simple charcoal sweater, dark jeans, and low heels. Nothing designer, nothing loud, nothing that signaled power to the people watching. And that was the point. She let the silence settle around her, heavy and charged, like the air before a storm. Across the counter, Daniel Reeves, the branch manager, mid-40s, crisp suit, silver tie, tightened his jaw as if her stillness offended him more than any argument could. I said step away. He repeated, louder this time, performing authority for the growing audience. Naomi's eyes lifted, calm, unreadable. She had seen this look before. At 22, when a lender smiled politely while denying her first business loan despite her numbers being better than anyone else in the room. At 31, when a real estate broker suggested she might be more comfortable looking in a different neighborhood. Different faces. Same tone. Same quiet assumption. Around her, the bank transformed. What had been a routine Tuesday morning turned into something else. A stage, a courtroom, a test. A man in a navy suit leaned slightly to get a better view. A woman near the rope divider whispered, "What's going on?" Someone farther back pulled out a phone, subtle but not invisible. Naomi felt it all without reacting. Every glance, every judgment, every expectation that she would shrink, apologize, explain. Daniel exhaled sharply, tapping a pen against the marble counter like a gavel. "You requested a $3 million withdrawal without proper verification," he said, voice dripping with controlled disbelief. "That's not how this works." Naomi tilted her head just slightly. "Then explain how it does," she said, her voice even, steady, carrying farther than his without ever rising. A flicker of irritation crossed his face. He hadn't expected engagement. He'd expected compliance. Behind him, a younger teller avoided eye contact, fingers frozen above her keyboard. Another employee leaned toward Daniel, whispering something too low to catch, but the tension in her posture said enough. Doubt was beginning to seep in, quiet and unwelcome. But Daniel doubled down. "We don't process transactions of that size for walk-ins dressed like." He stopped himself, but the damage was already done. The implication hung there, unfinished but understood. Naomi didn't blink. She let the moment breathe, let the room feel it, let the weight of that sentence settle on every person watching. Then, slowly, deliberately, she placed her hand flat against the cool marble surface of the counter, as if grounding herself in something deeper than the room, deeper than the assumptions pressing in from every side. Not fear, not anger, control. And somewhere beneath that calm, something else began to move, quiet, precise, inevitable. The kind of shift you don't notice until it's already too late. Naomi Carter did not argue, did not defend, did not rush to prove anything. Because this was never about the money and never about the withdrawal. It was about something far more revealing, something she had seen buried inside reports and complaints and quiet settlements that never made headlines. And now it was unfolding right in front of her exactly as she expected, almost on cue, like a system exposing itself the moment it was tested under the wrong assumptions. And that was why she had walked in alone, without an assistant, without a driver waiting outside, without the usual signals that told people to behave differently, because today was not about being recognized. It was about being measured by how they treated someone they thought did not matter. And across from her, Daniel Reeves shifted his stance again, trying to reclaim control of a situation that was slipping through his fingers one sentence at a time, his voice tightening as he gestured toward her account request on the screen. "There is a protocol for high-value transactions, and you are not following it," he said, emphasizing each word as if repetition could turn assumption into fact. But Naomi only watched him, her gaze steady, patient, almost curious, like she was observing a pattern rather than reacting to a person. And behind him the younger teller finally spoke, her voice hesitant. "Sir, the account number did match a priority tier profile," she said quietly, just enough for those closest to hear. And Daniel's head snapped slightly in her direction, a warning hidden in a glance. Then you should also know priority clients do not walk in unannounced asking for millions in cash, he replied, louder now, making sure the room heard him, reinforcing the narrative he needed to hold. And a man leaning against the far counter chuckled under his breath. Yeah, something does not add up, he muttered, not bothering to lower his voice. And the woman beside him nodded, eyes fixed on Naomi's clothes as if fabric alone could define legitimacy. And Naomi let it all pass through the room, every comment, every glance, every quiet agreement stacking on top of each other until the atmosphere felt heavier, thicker, like pressure building, behind glass. And then she moved, not abruptly, not defensively, just a small motion as she reached into her bag and placed her phone gently on the counter, screen facing down, deliberate, controlled, and Daniel noticed it immediately, his brows narrowing. You are not recording anything in here, he said quickly, stepping forward half an inch. But Naomi shook her head once, slow and calm. I do not need to, she replied. And something in the way she said it did not match the situation. It did not carry fear or urgency or even frustration. It carried certainty, the kind that does not explain itself because it does not have to. And for a brief second Daniel hesitated, just a flicker, barely visible. But enough, because doubt once introduced does not disappear. It spreads, quietly, persistently, and the young teller looked back at her screen again, her fingers hovering, then tapping something with more intent this time, her eyes narrowing as if she was seeing more than she had before. And Naomi noticed that too, not directly, but in the subtle shift of energy behind the counter, the kind of shift that comes before realization, and she exhaled slowly, not out of stress but timing, as if she was letting the moment reach exactly where it needed to be before anything changed. And when she spoke again her voice was just as calm as before. So tell me, she said, her eyes meeting Daniel's without hesitation. What exactly qualifies someone to access their own money in this bank? And this time the question did not sound like confusion. It sounded like a test already graded. Daniel Reeves did not answer the question right away, and that silence spoke louder than anything he could have said, because for the first time since Naomi had walked in, the structure he relied on began to fracture in small, almost invisible ways, the kind of fractures that spread quietly beneath polished surfaces until everything gives at once. And behind him the young teller leaned closer to her screen, her posture no longer hesitant but focused, her eyes scanning with a different kind of attention now, as if she had crossed from assumption into verification. And that shift did not go unnoticed by the others behind the counter, one employee glancing sideways, another straightening slightly, the unspoken tension moving through them like a ripple. But Daniel stepped forward again, cutting through it before it could grow. What qualifies someone? He repeated, his tone controlled but tighter now. Is compliance, documentation, and proper process, none of which you have demonstrated. And the words sounded rehearsed, safe, like something he had said before, something that usually worked. But Naomi did not respond immediately. She simply watched him, her expression unchanged, her presence steady in a way that made his certainty feel louder than it actually was. And from the waiting area a voice spoke up, a man in his 30s, business casual, arms folded. If her account is real, why not just check it? He said, not aggressive, just direct, and a few heads nodded, subtle at first, then more openly, because doubt had now moved beyond the counter and into the room, and Daniel noticed that too, his jaw tightening as he turned slightly toward the teller. Run it again, he said under his breath, low enough to sound controlled but sharp enough to carry authority, and the teller nodded quickly, fingers moving across the keyboard with more urgency this time, the soft clicking of keys suddenly louder than the murmurs around them. And Naomi's eyes flickered for just a second toward the screen, not to check, not to confirm, but to observe, because this was the moment she had been waiting for, not the reveal, not yet, but the shift, the point where the system begins to correct itself when pushed hard enough. And as the teller scrolled, her brows pulled together slightly, confusion first, then recognition, and she leaned closer, whispering, there is an executive flag on this account. And the words landed quietly but carried weight, enough that the employee beside her turned fully now, looking at the screen, then at Naomi, then back again, and Daniel's expression flickered, just for a second, before he stepped in again. Faster this. Time, flags do not override protocol, he said, louder, reclaiming the room before the information could take root, and the man from earlier shook his head slightly. Feels like you are making this harder than it needs to be, he muttered, and a woman near the entrance added. She has been calm this whole time, and that was the part that made it harder to dismiss. Naomi had not raised her voice, had not argued, had not broken the pattern they expected from someone being challenged, and that calm began to work against them, slowly turning the room, shifting the energy from suspicion towards something else, something closer to accountability, and Naomi finally spoke again, her voice just as steady as before. You keep saying protocol, she said, her eyes locked on Daniel. But protocol should protect the institution, not expose it. And the sentence hung there, heavier than anything before it, because it did not just question his decision, it questioned the system behind it, and for the first time Daniel did not immediately respond, because somewhere beneath his authority, beneath the routine and the control, something else had begun to surface, something he could not yet name, but could no longer ignore. The room did not return to normal after that sentence. It shifted, subtly but permanently, like something invisible had been pulled into the open and no one could quite look away from it anymore. And behind the counter the young teller swallowed hard, her eyes still locked on the screen, as if what she was seeing did not match what she had been told to believe, her voice lower this time but clearer. This is not just a priority account, she said, and the employee beside her leaned in closer, reading over her shoulder, their expressions tightening in sync, and Daniel noticed it immediately, the change in posture, the shared glance, the hesitation that should not have been there. That is enough. He cut in quickly, his tone sharper now, stepping closer to the terminal, as if proximity could control the outcome. But the teller did not move away, not this time. And that alone created a crack in the structure he had been holding together. And from the side of the room a woman spoke up, her voice steady. You should let her finish, and it was not loud, not aggressive, but it carried because by now the room had chosen to listen, and the teller took a breath, her fingers resting on the edge of the keyboard. There is an executive clearance tag tied to this account, she said, and the words landed differently than before, not as uncertainty, but as confirmation, and a quiet murmur spread through the space. People shifting their weight, glancing at Naomi, then back at the counter, trying to reconcile what they were hearing with what they had assumed just minutes earlier, and Daniel's jaw tightened again, his voice rising slightly. Tags can be misapplied, he said, forcing control back into his tone. That does not change protocol. But the confidence was thinner now, stretched, and Naomi watched it all without interruption, her stillness now carrying a different kind of weight, no longer just composure but presence, the kind that begins to define the room instead of react to it. And the man who had spoken earlier shook his head again, more openly this time. Feels like you are avoiding something, he said, and no one disagreed, not out loud. But the silence that followed said enough, and the teller hesitated for just a second before speaking again, her voice barely above a whisper, but somehow louder than anything Daniel had said. There is also a restricted access note, she added, and Daniel turned sharply. What note? He demanded, but she was already reading it, her eyes moving slowly across the screen as if each word mattered more than the last. Verification. Required at executive level only, she said, and that was the moment everything tilted, not fully, not yet, but enough that the balance was gone, because the system he had been using to deny her was now beginning to contradict him in real time, and Naomi let the silence stretch just long enough for it to settle over everyone, for the realization to begin forming in the edges of their thoughts, and then she spoke, calm as ever. So now the question changes, she said, her voice measured, precise. Not whether I qualify, but whether you do. And the words did not rise, did not strike, they simply landed. And in that moment the room did not feel like a bank anymore. It felt like something else entirely, something closer to truth being uncovered piece by piece. And for the first time since this began, Daniel Reeves did not have immediate control over what came next. The words settled into the room like a weight no one could lift, not quickly, not easily. And for a moment everything slowed, the quiet hum of the bank stretching into something tighter, something fragile, as if the entire space was holding its breath without realizing it. and Daniel Reeves stood there with his hand resting on the edge of the counter, his fingers tapping once, then stopping, because even that small movement felt too loud now, too exposed, and across from him Naomi Carter remained exactly as she had been from the beginning, still, composed, her presence no longer blending into the environment but defining it. And behind the counter the young teller glanced at Daniel, then back at the screen, caught between instruction and information, between authority and truth, and that tension showed in the slight tremble of her hand as she hovered over the keyboard, unsure which direction to follow. And the employee beside her leaned in again, whispering something this time that did not stay contained. "This level requires executive override," she said, just loud enough for the words to slip past the boundary of the counter and into the room. And that was the moment the atmosphere shifted again, deeper this time, more irreversible, because now it was no longer about one account or one decision. It was about access, about authority, about who had the right to decide what happened next. And Daniel straightened, pulling his shoulders back as if posture alone could restore control, then escalated internally, he said, his voice firm again. But the firmness sounded different now, forced, like something rehearsed rather than owned. And Naomi watched him for a second longer before her gaze moved slightly, not away, but past him, taking in the entire room, the witnesses, the quiet alignment forming without announcement, the subtle shift from observation to judgment. And in that moment something older surfaced in her memory, not loud, not overwhelming, but precise, a boardroom years ago where she had presented numbers that outperformed every competitor in the market, only to be asked if she had someone more senior who could speak on her behalf. The pause that followed when she said she was the senior authority, the same look she was seeing now, disbelief dressed as procedure, and the memory did not shake her. It steadied her, because it reminded her that this was never new, only repeated, and repetition made patterns, and patterns could be broken, but only when exposed. And she returned her focus to the present, to Daniel, to the system that was beginning to contradict him in real time. And she spoke again, her voice even, measured, carrying just enough to reach every corner of the room without needing to rise. "Go ahead," she said. "Escalate it." And there was no challenge in her tone, no defiance. Only permission. And that was what made it different, because permission shifts responsibility. It removes the excuse of uncertainty and replaces it with accountability. And Daniel hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, before turning toward the terminal, his hand moving to initiate the escalation he had just called for. And as he did, the young teller stepped back slightly, giving him access, her eyes no longer questioning but watching, closely, carefully, as if she understood now that whatever happened next would not just resolve a transaction. It would reveal something much larger. And Naomi remained where she was, her hand still resting lightly against the marble, her posture unchanged, her calm no longer passive but intentional. And as the system began to process the escalation request, the air in the room tightened once more, not with tension this time, but anticipation, the kind that comes just before something irreversible unfolds. The system did not respond immediately, and that delay stretched the moment into something sharper, something more revealing than any instant confirmation could have been, because in that pause every person in the room felt it, the shift from assumption to verification, from control to exposure. And Daniel Reeves stood there with his hand still on the terminal, eyes fixed on the screen as lines of data loaded one after another, his posture rigid now, not authoritative but braced, like someone waiting for an outcome he could no longer predict. And behind him the young teller leaned slightly to the side, not interfering but watching closely, her earlier hesitation gone, replaced by a quiet certainty that something important was about to surface. And Naomi Carter did not move, did not speak. She simply allowed the process to unfold, her calm now carrying a different kind of gravity, not passive but deliberate, like she had already seen the ending and was giving the room time to catch up. And then the first notification appeared, subtle, just a shift on the screen, but Daniel's eyes narrowed as he read it, his jaw tightening as the information aligned in a way that did not support his narrative. And he scrolled quickly, faster now, as if speed could change what was written there. But the more he moved, the clearer it became, and the teller saw it too, her breath catching slightly as she whispered, "This is tied to executive command access." and the words were no longer uncertain. They were factual, grounded, and the employee beside her stepped back half a step, processing, recalibrating, and across the room the murmurs grew again, not loud, but different this time, less questioning, more aware, and Naomi's gaze remained steady, fixed not on the screen but on Daniel, because this was no longer about data, it was about reaction, about how he would carry himself now that the ground beneath him had shifted, and for a moment he said nothing, his silence heavier than before, filled with the weight of realization he was not ready to voice. And then he cleared his throat, straightening slightly, attempting to regain structure. This requires higher-level confirmation, he said, but the sentence did not land the way he intended. It sounded like a step back, not a step forward, and Naomi tilted her head just slightly, her expression unchanged. Then confirm it, she replied, her voice calm, direct, and something in that response removed the last layer of hesitation from the room, because now there was no argument left, only process, and process reveals truth when it is allowed to run fully. And Daniel hesitated again, smaller this time, but unmistakable, before initiating the final authorization request, his fingers pressing the keys with a precision that felt tighter than before, and as the system processed, a second notification appeared, not subtle this time, but clear, definitive, and the teller stepped back completely now, her eyes widening just enough to signal what the screen already knew, and Daniel read it. Once, then again, as if repetition might change the meaning, but it did not. And in that moment something shifted in his posture, not dramatic, not obvious, but enough. The slight drop of his shoulders, the pause in his breath, the realization settling in, and Naomi watched it happen in real time. The exact moment authority met truth and could not override it. And she spoke again, softly, but with a clarity that carried through the entire space. You escalated it, she said. Now let it finish. And the room fell into a silence that was no longer tense, no longer uncertain, but expectant, because everyone there understood, whether they could name it or not, that whatever came next would not just resolve a transaction. It would redefine everything that had just happened. The confirmation did not arrive with noise or announcement. It appeared in silence, clean and undeniable, a line of authority written into the system that did not ask for belief because it carried proof. And Daniel Reeves stared at it, as if the screen had shifted into something unfamiliar, something he could not control or reinterpret, his eyes moving slowly across the words, then stopping, then returning again, as if reading it twice might soften what it meant, but it did not, and behind him. The young teller stepped back fully now, her hands no longer near the keyboard, her posture straight, her expression no longer uncertain but aware, because she understood before anyone said it out loud that what they were seeing was not a correction, it was a revelation, and the employee beside her lowered his gaze, the earlier confidence gone, replaced by something quieter, something closer to realization. And across the room the murmurs faded into a silence that felt heavier than anything before it, because now people were not guessing, they were waiting, and Naomi Carter remained exactly where she had been, her hand resting lightly against the counter, her shoulders relaxed, her presence unchanged, but the room around her had shifted completely, and that contrast made her stillness feel louder than any reaction could have been. And Daniel finally spoke, but the words came slower now, measured, careful. This account, he began, then stopped, because even he could hear the difference in his own voice, the loss of certainty, the absence of control, and Naomi watched him for a moment longer before she spoke, not to interrupt, not to challenge, but to complete what he could not say. Requires executive authorization, she said, her tone even, finishing the sentence he had started, and he nodded once, almost involuntarily, because the system left no room for denial. And that was when she stepped forward, not abruptly, not dramatically, just one step, closing the distance between them in a way that shifted the entire dynamic of the space. And when she spoke again her voice did not rise, it did not need to, because the room was already listening, completely. You question my withdrawal, she said, each word precise, controlled, in a bank that reports directly to my office. And the sentence did not land like an accusation. It landed like truth being placed exactly where it belonged, undeniable and complete. and Daniel's expression changed, not dramatically, but enough, the tightening of his jaw giving way to stillness, the attempt at authority dissolving into recognition, and the teller's eyes widened slightly, her gaze moving from the screen to Naomi and back again, connecting the information in real time. And someone in the room exhaled softly, the sound small but amplified by the silence around it. Because now the realization was no longer private, it was shared, and Naomi held his gaze for one more second before adding, just as calm, just as precise. "I did not come here to prove who I am," she said. "I came to see how this place treats someone you think is not." And that was the moment the room fully shifted, not just in understanding, but in alignment, because the story they had been watching was no longer about a transaction. It was about something deeper, something systemic, something exposed in real time, and Daniel Reeves stood there, no longer the one directing the situation, but the one inside it, facing a truth that had been there from the beginning, waiting to be seen. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt decisive, like a line had been drawn through everything that had just happened and no one could step back across it. And Daniel Reeves stood there with the weight of that realization settling in fully now, not in fragments, not in doubt, but in clarity, his posture no longer rigid with authority, but held in place by something heavier, accountability. And the screen in front of him remained unchanged, still displaying the confirmation that had shifted the entire room, as if it did not need to update because the truth it carried was already complete. And behind him the young teller slowly lowered her hands to her sides, no longer part of the process but a witness to its outcome. Her eyes fixed on Naomi Carter with a mixture of respect and understanding that had not been there before, and the employee beside her exhaled quietly, his earlier certainty replaced by a stillness that spoke louder than any apology could. And across the room the audience that had formed without intention now stood in a different kind of silence, not curiosity, not tension, but recognition, because they had watched the entire shift unfold step by step, assumption turning into exposure, control turning into consequence. And Naomi remained steady at the center of it all, her presence unchanged, her calm now fully understood, not as restraint, but as power held in reserve. And she moved her hand slightly away from the counter, not withdrawing, just releasing, as if the moment no longer required her to hold it in place. And when she spoke again her voice was quiet but carried with absolute clarity. "Process the withdrawal," she said, not as a demand, not as a reaction, but as a continuation of what should have happened from the beginning. And Daniel nodded once, the motion small but significant, because it was no longer about permission or denial, it was compliance, and he turned back to the terminal, his movements slower now, deliberate, careful, entering the authorization codes that only minutes ago he had insisted she could not access. And the system responded instantly this time. No delay, no hesitation, the transaction approved as if it had been waiting all along for the right authority to align with it. And the teller stepped forward again, this time not uncertain but precise, following the steps exactly as required, her voice steady as she confirmed the amount, the account, the release, and each word carried a different weight now, because they were no longer being questioned, they were being executed. And as the process completed, a subtle shift moved through the room. Not applause, not reaction, but acknowledgement, the kind that does not need to be spoken because it is already understood. And Naomi watched it all without expression, without satisfaction, because this was never about winning a moment. It was about revealing one. And she turned her gaze back to Daniel, not with anger, not with triumph, but with something sharper, something final. And she said, "You followed the system when it was easy," her voice even, controlled. "But you challenged it when it mattered." And the sentence did not accuse, it defined. And Daniel lowered his eyes briefly, not in defeat but in recognition, because there was no argument left to make. And in that moment the structure of the room had changed completely, not in appearance, but in meaning, because everyone there had seen what happens when quiet authority meets exposed bias. And the outcome did not need to be announced. It was already clear. The transaction completed without ceremony, no sound, no signal, just a quiet confirmation on the screen that something significant had already taken place. And Naomi Carter watched it for a brief moment before lifting her eyes back to the room, not scanning, not searching, simply acknowledging what had shifted, because the change was no longer subtle. It was embedded in every posture, every glance, every silence that followed. And Daniel Reeves stood there with his hands resting lightly against the counter, no longer directing, no longer correcting, just present, absorbing the outcome of a moment that had moved beyond his control long before he realized it. And behind him the young teller straightened fully, her expression composed now, professional, but different, as if something had recalibrated in the way she understood the space she worked in, and the employee beside her avoided eye contact entirely, focused instead on the terminal, on anything that did not reflect back what had just unfolded. And across the room the witnesses began to shift again, some stepping back, some turning away, but none of them returning to the version of the room that had existed before, because once something like this is seen clearly, it cannot be unseen. And Naomi reached for her phone, lifting it from the counter with the same calm precision she had carried from the beginning. Not rushed, not reactive, just complete. And she paused for a moment, not out of hesitation but intention, giving the room one last second to settle into what it had become. And then she spoke, her voice steady, measured, carrying without effort. "This was never about $3 million, she said. And no one interrupted, no one moved, because every person there understood that the statement was not for explanation, it was for definition. And she continued, "It was about what happens when someone walks in without the image you expect." And the words landed clean, not emotional, not raised, just placed exactly where they belonged. And Daniel lowered his gaze again briefly, not out of submission but recognition, because there was nothing left to defend. And Naomi stepped back from the counter, creating space where there had once been tension, her presence no longer holding the moment together because it no longer needed to be held. And she added one final sentence, quieter than the rest, but sharper in its clarity. "I did not raise my voice," she said, her eyes moving across the room one last time. "I raised the standard." And that was it. No emphasis, no pause for reaction, just a statement that settled into the room and stayed there. And she turned, walking toward the exit with the same calm, deliberate pace she had entered with, no faster, no slower, leaving behind a space that looked exactly the same, but felt entirely different. And as the doors closed behind her, the silence that remained was not empty. It was filled with understanding, the kind that does not announce itself, but changes everything it touches.